Before you begin watching this video, get your camera so you can stop the video and try out the settings that are explained in the video. Welcome to Basic Photography. This is a video of a slideshow that talks about basic camera settings. Before we get started, please pause the video and read the following definitions. These terms will be used throughout this video. The purpose of this video is to help you move from the camera's preset features commonly found on most cameras. We're going to move you to the fully manual setting where you have full control of the camera. Almost all cameras will show a light meter when the camera is set to manual. It tells you if you have too much light or too little light. You'll see this light meter chart throughout this presentation. Most basic cameras allow you to zoom in or closer to your subject or to zoom out for a wider view. We measure this distance in millimeters. In this example, setting the lens at 18 millimeters will give you a broader view, or zoomed out. When you set a higher millimeter number, such as 135 millimeter, it brings your subject closer. Today's cameras come with dozens of features and settings. It is no wonder beginning and amateur photographers select the automatic or preset features rather than using the manual setting. In this video, we will only focus on the basic features of the digital camera. We'll first start with the shutter. It has two functions. The first function is to control the amount of time that light is exposed to the sensor. We describe the shutter in terms of time and mostly in fractions of a second. The faster the shutter speed, the less time that light is allowed to enter the camera. So a 2/1000th of a second lets in less light than 1/100th of a second. A faster shutter speed lets in less light, causing the photo to be darker. We call this being underexposed. If the shutter speed is slow and causing the photo to be light, we call this condition as an overexposed photo. Here is how the shutter works. First, an example of a slow shutter speed. One shutter goes down, followed by a second shutter. Notice how for a moment the sensor is exposed to light. In this next example, the shutter is set at a fast speed of 2/1000ths of a second. Notice that the space between the shutters is much smaller, further decreasing the amount of light to reach the sensor. Let's say you have a shutter speed of 250th of a second. The meter shows that you have less light and therefore is underexposed. By slowing the shutter down, for example to 60th of a second, the meter now indicates too much light and therefore is overexposed. When moving the button or wheel on your camera that controls the shutter speed, keep your eye on the meter. When it is in the middle, you have a good exposure. What is important to know is that the meter will tell you when you have an even exposure. The aperture controls the size of the opening in the lens and thus controls the amount of light that gets into the camera by the size of the opening, whereas the shutter controls light by time. The aperture settings are measured in numbers in what we call f-stops. The lower the f-stop number, the bigger the opening and more light enters the camera. A higher f-stop number, the smaller the opening and less light enters the camera. Confused? Think of the f-stop as a fraction of 1. An f-stop 3 would be 1/3 of the pi, whereas an f-stop of 10 would be 1/10 of the pi, which would be much smaller piece of a pie or less light. Here is an f-stop 2.4 with a fairly large opening. As you can see here, an f-stop 5.6 has a smaller opening. The f-stop 8 is smaller. F-stop 11 is even smaller. And here we have f-stop 18, which is really small, letting in very little light. Let's say you have an aperture of f22, which is a very small opening. The meter shows that you have less light, and therefore your photo will be underexposed. By setting the aperture to f3.5, you have more light. Now the meter indicates too much light, and therefore your photo will be overexposed. By moving the button or wheel on your camera that controls the aperture, keep your eye on the meter. When it is in the middle, you have a good exposure. The meter will tell you when the aperture is at the correct opening for an even exposure. The shutter and aperture have an interconnecting relationship. As you can see on this chart, if you set the aperture or the shutter to allow more light into the camera, the meter will move towards the right side and thus overexpose your photograph. If you set the aperture or shutter to allow less light into the camera, the meter will move towards the left side and thus underexpose your photograph. You need to find a balance between the aperture and the shutter so that you have an even exposure. This is indicated when the meter is in the middle. In this animation, we start off with an evenly exposed meter. If you change either the shutter or aperture, you'll need to compensate with either the shutter or aperture. In cases where you have insufficient light, the exposure meter will be to the far left, indicating the photo is going to be underexposed. Your shutter might be as slow as you can set it without camera shake, and the aperture might be wide open. So what do? Just as with the old-fashioned film camera, which could load film that was more sensitive to light, thus providing more flexibility for the shutter and aperture, you can increase the sensitivity of the sensor. We call this the ISO setting. It usually starts with a low number of 100, and as the number goes up, so does the sensitivity to light. Here are two examples of what your ISO menu might look like in your camera. Note that you also have an automatic setting, which we will discuss shortly. To move the light meter indicator towards the middle, increase the ISO setting to a higher number. In this example, we've raised the ISO number to 400, and the meter shows a slightly overexposed setting. This is okay. Now readjust either the shutter or aperture to reduce light and bring the meter towards the center for an even exposure. In this example, we've increased the shutter speed to 1/20th of a second. Now you must be careful The higher the number, the more grainy the image will become. And if you plan to crop a photo, a high ISO may leave the photo too discolored to use. See the following examples. In this example, the ISO is set for 100. The photo is relatively clear and sharp. Because the subject was indoors in low light, a tripod was also used. Now we have changed the ISO to 1600. This has caused the photo to be grainy and discolored, so be careful when using a high ISO. I recommend leaving the ISO at the lowest setting. If it is a cloudy day outside or you're photographing inside under low light, go ahead and raise the ISO. Just be careful not to raise it too high. You need to practice with your camera to determine at what point the ISO will hurt the quality of your photographs. Using the ISO automatic setting will be discussed at the end of Chapter 2. The second purpose of the shutter is to capture movement, either to make it stand still or to soften or blur the image to give the feeling of motion. In this example, a slow shutter speed has softened the flow of water. Here we used a fast shutter speed, which has captured the movement of the runner, baseman, and the speeding ball. The second function of the aperture is to control the focus of items that are in front of and behind your subject. We call this the depth of field or depth of focus. If the aperture opening is large, the depth of field will be small. And vice versa, a small opening will be a large depth of field. The example on the left shows a low f-stop number, or a large opening. The depth of field will be small. The example on the right shows a high f-stop number, or a smaller opening. This will result in a large depth of field. In this diagram, a person is photographing an item 20 feet away with an f-stop of 3.5. The lens will only focus on objects between 17 and 24 feet. At the same position, but with an f-stop of 22, the range of what will be in focus is now from 9 feet to infinity. The depth of field is also impacted by the distance from the subject. Using an f-stop of 3.5, the further away you stand from the subject, the deeper or larger the depth of field. That is, more things will be in focus in front of and behind the subject. Finally, the depth of field can be impacted using a zoom lens. Zooming into the subject is the same as walking closer to the subject. As you zoom closer to the subject, the depth of field becomes shorter or less. Here is an example of a large depth of field. The people and the background are in focus using f13. In this example, a setting of f5.6, the people are in focus, but the background is not in focus. The depth of field needs to be considered if you want the background in focus. In this example, an f-stop of 11 using a wide-angle setting of 18 mm allows the background to be in focus. This is important if you want to crop the photo later. Here is an example of a very shallow or short depth of field of only about 3 inches. Notice how the entire background is out of focus. Here is another example of a short depth of field. Notice that the people behind and in front of the boy are not in focus. Now let's discuss the automatic ISO feature. The ISO will adjust the meter when you adjust the aperture, and or the shutter settings, and the light meter will stay in the middle. It is important that you set your aperture based upon the depth of field you want, and to set the shutter on whether you want to capture motion of the subject or just show movement. In example 1, you have a large aperture and slow shutter speed, thus allowing a lot of light to enter the camera. As a result, the ISO has set itself at 100 to provide an even exposure. In example 2, you have a small aperture and a fast shutter speed. The ISO has increased to 1000 in order to provide an even exposure. As long as your aperture and shutter settings are set first by you, it will be okay for the ISO to compensate to ensure an even exposure. But be careful. Reducing lighting from the aperture and shutter may result in a high ISO and poor quality photograph. And that's basic photography. But wait, there's more. For your information, the front of your lens contains important information about your aperture. The number 1.4 on the lens on the left indicates the largest aperture opening for that lens, whereas the lens to the right has a smaller maximum opening of 3.5. The second number in that lens, 5.6, indicates the largest aperture when the lens is zoomed out. Here is why your largest aperture gets smaller when zooming out. It is called the barreling effect, where the amount of light is reduced as the lens zooms out. This results in less light reaching the sensor. Most cameras give you the choice of either allowing the camera to decide what to focus on or letting you select what to focus on. When you look through the viewfinder or LCD screen, you'll see these points light up. The problem with the autofocus points is that the camera will decide on what object it will focus upon, which may not be the subject you want to photograph. Therefore, it is strongly suggested that you select the manual focus points. And note, this setting does not impact the camera's feature to automatically focus on things, or with you turning the focusing ring to focus on the subject. In this photo, if the camera focus point was set on auto, it probably would have focused on the runner in the foreground. But for this photo, the photographer selected the manual focusing point, placing the focus box on the subject, being the boy. This way, the camera focuses on the young runner. The camera has several light metering modes, which impact the light exposure meter. These selections decide if the meter will look at the entire scene or reduce the area for light metering. Most cameras have either 3 or 4 metering modes. All cameras have a selection which looks at the entire area to find a balance between under and overexposure. This is a safe setting for beginning photographers. Most cameras have this selection where the border area is pretty much ignored. This is good for photos where the border is either too dark or light when compared to the center of the photo area. The center weighted setting looks at the major center of the photo. This is more specialized and should only be used after you have practiced with this setting enough to understand how it handles exposure. Spot metering determines the exposure based on a small part of the scene. This should only be used after you fully understand how to use the other metering settings. White balance settings adjust the sensor in the way it reads the type of light that the sensor is being exposed to. For example, fluorescent lights are different than incandescent or sunlight. The automatic white balance is good for most outdoor and daylight settings. If you are photographing indoors, one of the presets for for example fluorescent or incandescent, might be a better choice. You also have a custom setting. You photograph a white piece of paper in the room, which will then tell the camera the type of lighting you are in and adjust accordingly. Some cameras will let you set by kelvins, but this is more for the professional. Here is an example of an incorrect white balance. It was set for indoor incandescent light, but the photographer forgot to change the setting when he went outdoors. It appears to be a bluish moonlight, but is actually a bright sunny day. Let's review what we have learned. When preparing to take the photo, ask yourself what needs to be in focus in front of and behind the subject. This will determine your aperture. Ask yourself whether you want to capture the subject's motion or just show it moving, and then adjust the shutter speed for the result you want. And finally, raise the ISO if there's not enough light. And remember to use the light meter to ensure you have a good exposure. I hope this has been of some help to you. Now move your dial on your camera to the manual setting and start taking really great pictures.